What challenges have you faced as an African American professor in the field of psychology, clinical psychology, both in academia and in professional practice?
The work I do that I'd consider supporting people's mental health processes is mainly working with Black men. And working with Black men can sometimes bring up my own internalized oppression of the experience. So me internalizing these stereotypes that have been perpetuated on me throughout my life. So it is a decolonizing act that's liberational, but it's also is looking at some of the shadows that I still hold from my conditioning. Now, in terms of the modalities, indigenous wisdom is kind of been co-opted and commodified in our society mainly as a South American thing. And then at this university, let's say, contemplative or mindfulness has been kind of co-opted and commodified as an Eastern thing. So that's where I run up in both realms, in the underground clinical realm and in the teaching realm. I do run up against the conception that African or Pan-African or African-American folks aren't engaged in spirit and mysticism. A lot of us have been co-opted by the church, which was a survival thing. We weren't allowed to gather more than a couple people at a time during the Black Code era in the South without being harassed or seen as a mob. So the only place for us to gather and have community was the church. So similar to some Latin cultures that have been drawn towards the church, even though it was part of their colonization process, that was put there as a place that made us feel safe. Black folks have been, in my opinion, rewarded, like operant conditioning has been used in a really manipulative way in our country, where we learn from love and from pain. And really what we're talking about is acceptance or being dismissed or rejected. This society often has embraced us and given us love when we've done things that are self-harming, right? Like engaged in certain music forms that are minimizing our potential and so forth, right? Like what they would call gangster rap, let's say, which is allowed to be part of our expression, but the fact that it's rewarded and embraced versus intellectualism, family care and things is shunned, right? So we're receiving that sort of condition. Now, does that mean that we are gangster rap? Absolutely not. Does that mean that we don't take care of our families? We absolutely do, right? I'm just speaking to the systems at play. Fortunately, we are, most of the time, what I've observed is the way we show up is efforting to have mental health. We just utilize different places typically than the general therapeutic setting. So maybe our mental health will come from, stereotypically, it comes from places like the barbershop, but it really does. When I go get my haircut, I have a therapy session. I'm not charged for that, I'm charged for a haircut, but that is part of the process. But a lot of it will come from communal experiences, like gathering with family, Sunday dinners, these sorts of things are ways that we engage in therapy in our community, as well as church and places of worship, absolutely. Teaching in the mental health counseling program at Naropa specifically is a lonely experience. The sense of community comes from the few Black students, and I could even extend that to the spectrum of BIPOC, actually. I've noticed. And then there's, of course, limitations there because of the role power dynamics and ethics and so forth, so that can only go so far. But I don't know of any other Black professor at Naropa in the graduate programs. So that specific aspect of BIPOC is not present for me. But I've also found that you particularly have been able to show an extreme amount of empathy towards my experience of being a Black professor. For the sake of time, and there's other questions I know, My main thing is that I feel dismissed often, and as if my wisdom is invalidated by my Blackness, or people use my Blackness to invalidate my wisdom. I don't feel like I get the same respect as white professors from the students in terms of diligence around submitting their assignments, in terms of like respecting the structure of the course, and definitely in terms of critique. Part of the challenge of being oppressed or feeling marginalized or being marginalized is the unknown, right? So there's a lot of times where I don't know if something is happening because of someone's racism or if it's because of some other reason. And sitting with that unknown is a burden in itself.
What changes do you believe are necessary to make psychology, clinical psychology, a more inclusive and equitable field for Black professionals and patients alike?
Well, yeah, we're talking the field of psychology, which, if I'm not mistaken, does include clinical and research, is about 4% Black. If I'm not mistaken, the census says something about 12 to 13% Black folks in America. I would love to increase that 9% to at least be at the average. Yeah, to at least be at the statistical average by the Census Bureau, so that 13% of the field of psychology is made up of Black folks would be great. That's a start. Here at Naropa, reaching out to more BIPOC communities, going into Denver and Aurora and Commerce City, where a lot of the Latin and Black communities have been gentrified into, and going to some of the college fairs, not just marketing a couple of Black people on the wall outside, and making the experience of BIPOC and Black faculty a little bit safer emotionally, because I've worked with Black professionals here who have quit within a semester, literally last semester, right? So it takes a certain type of Black experience for people to sustain things here. Typically the Black folks that have spent time around white folks or in mainly white communities last a little bit longer. And then the cost of living. So having some sort of stipend for BIPOC or Black faculty would be helpful, or for all faculty, would be helpful for bringing in a more diverse population here.
Let me ask another question, because these are all transpersonal psychology students.
Yeah.
So from a transpersonal psychology perspective, how has your experience as a, it says African American, but as a Black professor, Black American, shape your understanding of the intersection between racial identity, spirituality, and healing?
Well, just being here is a destabilizing experience, somatically, psychologically, and at times it can feel like spiritually. So I have had to dig deep into my toolkit and do a lot of independent research. I reach out to Black community members outside of Boulder, typically, and Black practitioners in the transpersonal field, Dieterville at CIS and other folks, to kind of engage in Ubuntu or like collective Yorubic wisdoms for protection, is what I call it, to be able to sustain the spiritual warfare that I feel like is my experience at Naropa at times. I think seeing us as a community, regardless of melanin activity, and my transpersonal concept that I will not reach self-realization without everyone else also achieving that, and my disbelief in individual self-transcendence, right, and my commitment and faith in collective transcendence helps. But you know, as I mentioned before in this class, my mother was murdered in 1993 when she was 28 years old, and I do call on her spirit, the spirit of my grandmother, my great-grandmother, who was a sharecropper in Arkansas, and I call on my descendants that I have yet to meet. So I call on my great-grandchildren that I might not ever meet, and I call on this community, this spiritual council, I call it in the Black community. I rely on my spiritual council to balance and be present in the moment as much as possible. So yeah, it's an ongoing practice within this fractal experience of living in this body.
And continuing with the transpersonal theme, how has your understanding of transpersonal psychology influenced your clinical approach to addressing racial trauma and the psychological well-being of African American clients?
Well, yeah, it's not possible to ignore the potential impact of racism on the Black body. So I think recently I've been learning about how much trauma shows up in the body, But the main thing for now is my recent takeaway that like we are not just, yes, there's internalized oppression, and absolutely we are reacting and responding to oppression, often in various settings, the series of microaggressions like add up over time, but that there is an essential blackness or being black that is deeper and older than our experience of oppression in the United States of North America. So allowing space for that, being proud of our resilience and durability, but knowing that most of the black people I work with have spiritual resilience and spiritual durability that has been built up either through relationship with God, with Allah, through mindfulness practices like hip-hop meditation, walking, physical practices, Kemetic yoga or Egyptian yoga, and things like this, freestyle rapping, right, and poetry and different things, braiding hair and that the communal experience of that touch, barbershop, as I mentioned, these things all have transpersonal aspects to them, right, in this, including the mystical in the mundane, right, just in our everyday dishwashing, going to the laundromat, feeling the water on your hands in these sittings is a form of spiritual libation, like a water pouring experience in the Yoruba tradition. But just being proud of the fact that there is this transpersonal durability and resilience, but also having the imagination and the fantasy to be able to believe that this will end, that this experience of oppression will go away at some point, and we won't be drowning, per se, in this systematic experience, and that there's some foundational beauty and magic to our blackness that can never be fully distinguished by oppression.
I'm going to deviate from these questions a little bit because something comes to mind as you're talking about your commitment, which has to do with your dissertation. And I don't want to embarrass you, but would you share a little bit of what you're working with your dissertation?
Yeah, mainly it's actually addressing most of the questions you brought up, the dissertation does. And the problem is a lack of representation in the field of psychology generally. So the APA defining it loosely as like the mind, and I guess at Naropa we'd add the body and the spirit, but the mind and its functioning in these various contexts, with about 2% representation of research psychologists based on that 4% statistic, there's not a lot of research studies that have been done by black people for black people, and this is in the variety of identities as well, but today we're speaking on this specific subject of blackness and racism. So our gifts to the discipline and the gift of our personal and transpersonal nature of our beingness and our minds, our psyches, is not being shared and not adding to the data pool that can help inform us on the various ways that humans show up, that we can then use to construct modalities and spiritual and transpersonal practices and approaches that can meet the needs of more humans generally. When we study the black mind and its functioning, personal and transpersonal, it helps everyone, ultimately, by adding to that data pool experiences and modalities and things that can be catered towards the black mind and its functioning in this context of the United States and North America are not modalities and strategies that won't be transferable and applicable to other populations. So we're missing out on the fullness of the nectar of what blackness has to offer. So studying the single black father in the United States of North America not only gave me an opportunity to engage with other black men like myself who have been solo or single fathering for various amounts of time, so it helped me feel a sense of community, but it also was doing a favor to the discipline of psychology by introducing it, much more so than in the past, and much more work needs to be done, but to the way that we process information, the way that we experience spirit, and the way that we have magical and transcendent experiences with our children, and just in the act of parenting itself.